Alcina Dimitrescu stands 9 feet, 6 inches tall in her heels. When she moves through the halls of her ancestral castle, the floorboards groan under her weight, and the chandeliers sway from the vibration. She is elegant, poised, draped in cream-colored fabric and pearl necklaces that seem absurdly delicate against her massive frame. She speaks with the refined accent of pre-war European nobility, and when she smiles, it is with the practiced grace of someone who has spent decades perfecting the performance of civility. But underneath that performance, underneath the silk and the pearls and the carefully maintained veneer of aristocratic refinement, is something far more complicated than the internet's fascination with her height and aesthetics would suggest. Tonight, we're going deep into the psychology of Lady Dimitrescu. Not the memes, not the fan art, not the cultural phenomenon she became in the months after Resident Evil Village's release. We're talking about the actual character, the woman who existed before the Cadou parasite transformed her body, and the monster she became after Mother Miranda's experiments rewired her biology and her mind. We're examining her relationships with her daughters, her obsessive devotion to Miranda, her aristocratic pretensions, and the violence that bubbles constantly beneath her controlled exterior. This is going to be long, detailed, and we're using real psychological frameworks to understand what makes Alcina Dimitrescu one of the most psychologically complex antagonists in survival horror. Settle in, get comfortable. We're walking through Castle Dimitrescu room by room, examining not just what Lady D does, but why she does it, what drives her, what terrifies her, and what her existence tells us about identity, transformation, body horror, and the desperate human need to maintain control even as everything inside you is falling apart. The aristocrat and the blood disease. Let's start with who Alcina Dimitrescu was before Mother Miranda, before the Cadou parasite, before the castle became a slaughterhouse masquerading as a vineyard. According to the documents found throughout Resident Evil Village, Lady Dimitrescu was born into the noble Dimitrescu family sometime before the Great War, likely before World War I, which places her birth in the late 1800s or very early 1900s. She inherited not just a title and an ancestral home, but also a hereditary blood disease, possibly porphyria cutanea tarda, a condition that affects the production of heme in the blood and can cause severe photosensitivity, blistering, and other symptoms that have historically been associated with vampire legends. But before any of that defined her, before illness and mutation and monstrosity, Alcina Dimitrescu was a jazz singer, not a noblewoman dabbling in music as a hobby, but an actual performer with a band called Miss D and the Paul Boys. There's a CD of her work sitting in the Winters home at the beginning of Village, a detail so easily missed that most players never notice it. But it matters. It tells us that at some point in her life, Alcina Dimitrescu wanted to be seen and heard for something other than her bloodline. She wanted to create, to perform, to be known for her voice rather than her title. This is psychologically significant because it establishes a tension that will define her entire existence, the conflict between what she was born to be and what she wanted to become. Nobility in pre-war Europe was not just about wealth or property. It was about maintaining appearances, adhering to strict codes of conduct, preserving bloodlines, and performing a specific kind of identity in public. Deviation from that script, especially for women, was social suicide. For a noble woman to become a jazz singer, to perform in front of audiences, to associate with musicians who were almost certainly not of her class, was a profound act of rebellion. Imagine the psychology of that choice. You're born into a family with centuries of history, with expectations so rigid they feel like iron bars around your ribs. You're told from childhood that your value lies in your lineage, your marriageability, your ability to continue the family name with the appropriate level of dignity. And then you discover music. You discover that when you sing, people listen not because of who your grandfather was, but because of what you can do with your voice. That must have felt like freedom. It must have felt like finally being seen as a person rather than as a function of your surname. But then the blood disease. The documents in Village don't specify exactly when her symptoms began, but porphyria and similar hereditary blood disorders often manifest in early adulthood and can be triggered or exacerbated by stress, sun exposure, or other environmental factors. The symptoms can be debilitating, severe pain, blistering skin that makes sunlight unbearable, chronic fatigue, and in severe cases, neurological effects that can include anxiety, confusion, and mood disturbances. For someone whose life revolved around performance, whose identity had been built around being seen and heard, developing a condition that made appearing in public physically agonizing must have been devastating. This is where we start to see the psychological foundation for who Lady Dimitrescu becomes later. She's someone who tasted autonomy, who experienced what it felt like to be valued for her abilities rather than her bloodline, and then had that autonomy stripped away by biology. Her body betrayed her. The illness would have forced her back into the confines of nobility, back to the castle, back to the restrictions of her class, back to a life defined by what she couldn't do rather than what she could. That kind of loss doesn't just disappear, it festers. It transforms into resentment, into a deep seated rage at the injustice of it, at the cruelty of finally finding something that feels like self determination only to have it taken away by forces completely outside your control. And then, decades later, she returns to her ancestral homeland. The documents describe her as a deposed noblewoman by the time she meets Mother Miranda, suggesting that whatever status her family once held had crumbled. The social structures that had defined her existence, the very systems that had simultaneously oppressed and legitimized her, had collapsed. The title that once meant something was now just a word. The castle was likely in disrepair. She was in her early 40s, suffering from a worsening blood disease, no longer able to perform, no longer able to maintain the aristocratic life she'd been raised to uphold, and living in a world that had moved on from the kind of rigid class hierarchies that had given her family power. Psychologically, this is a state of profound identity crisis. Who are you when the structures that defined you no longer exist? Who is Alcina Dimitrescu when nobility means nothing, when her body won't cooperate, when the music career is long over, when everything she was and everything she tried to become has led to this? Middle-aged, ill, isolated in a crumbling castle in a forgotten village. This is not just loss. This is existential collapse. This is the annihilation of self. And that's when Mother Miranda finds her. Mother Miranda and the Cadou Mother Miranda is the architect of every horror in Resident Evil Village. But what makes her particularly dangerous as a cult leader and a manipulator is her ability to identify people at their lowest points and offer them exactly what they need most. For Alcina Dimitrescu, what she needed was a body that worked. What she needed was power. What she needed was to matter again. Miranda had been experimenting with the Cadou parasite for decades by the time Dimitrescu entered her orbit. The Cadou, derived from the megamycete mold and meaning gift or present in Romanian, was Miranda's attempt to create vessels that could potentially house the consciousness of her dead daughter, Eva. Most subjects who received the Cadou died or transformed into lichens, mindless, grotesque creatures that retained almost nothing of their original humanity. A tiny percentage survived with their cognition intact, but were still transformed in ways that made them monstrous. Alcina Dimitrescu became subject 181. The experiment was high risk. Most likely, Miranda explained that there was a significant chance of death or complete loss of self. But for someone in Dimitrescu's position, suffering, purposeless, watching her body deteriorate and her legacy crumble, the risk must have seemed acceptable. What did she have to lose? Her life as it was had become unbearable. Death or transformation were both preferable to slow decay in an empty castle. The Cadou took. Her body accepted the parasite with what the research notes describe as very high affinity. Unlike the other subjects who either died or became mindless monsters, Dimitrescu retained her cognition. She retained her memories, her personality, her sense of self. In fact, she demonstrated something extraordinary: the ability to arbitrarily control her body transformation. She could shift her form, could extend parts of herself, could manipulate her biology in ways that suggested an almost unprecedented level of compatibility with the parasite. But there were complications. The Cadou had an adverse reaction with her hereditary blood disease. The parasite triggered uncontrolled growth, stretching her body to a height of 9.5 feet. Her hands elongated, her bones thickened, her entire frame expanded in ways that made her simultaneously imposing and grotesque, and the blood disease that had plagued her for years intensified. Her body now required constant consumption of human blood to maintain stability. Without it, she would begin to degenerate, her regenerative abilities faltering, her mutations becoming uncontrollable. Psychologically, this transformation is both liberation and new imprisonment. On one hand, Dimitrescu was cured of weakness. Her body, which had been failing her for decades, was now extraordinarily powerful. She had superhuman strength, regenerative abilities that made her nearly invulnerable to conventional harm, and control over her form that gave her a kind of agency over her physicality that she'd never possessed before. She was no longer at the mercy of her illness. She had transcended the limitations that had defined her existence. But on the other hand, she had become dependent on something even more invasive than her original disease. She now required human blood, not metaphorically, not as some aristocratic affectation, but as a biological necessity. Without regular consumption of blood, her body would fail in ways even worse than before. The Cadou had saved her life, but at the cost of making her a predator. She could no longer exist in human society. She could no longer pass as normal. She was, in every literal sense, a monster now. This creates a fascinating psychological contradiction. Lady Dimitrescu gained power, but lost humanity. She gained control over her body, but became enslaved to its new appetites. She escaped one form of biological imprisonment only to enter another. And crucially, she knows this. She's not a mindless creature acting on instinct. She retained her cognition, which means she retained the ability to understand exactly what she's become and what she must do to survive. Every time she drains a maiden's blood, she's fully aware that she's killing someone. She's not doing it in a fugue state or a frenzy. She's doing it with the same calm, calculated precision with which she pours wine. This awareness is what separates her psychologically from the other lords. Moreau is pathetic, desperately seeking Miranda's approval while barely retaining coherent thought. Donna Beneviento is so psychologically damaged that she barely speaks and operates primarily through her doll Angie. Karl Heisenberg is consumed by resentment and rebellion, his identity almost entirely built around opposing Miranda, but Dimitrescu retains the full weight of self-awareness. She knows what she is, she knows what she does, and she has chosen to embrace it. The performance of civility, one of the most psychologically revealing aspects of Lady Dimitrescu, is not her violence, but the way she frames that violence within the aesthetics of aristocratic refinement. Her castle is immaculately maintained. The halls are lined with paintings and sculptures. The dining room table is set with fine china. The wine cellar is extensive, carefully curated, each bottle labeled and organized. She dresses in elegant gowns, wears jewelry, maintains her appearance with the kind of attention to detail that suggests she spends considerable time in front of mirrors. When she speaks, her language is formal, almost archaic, peppered with terms of endearment that sound affectionate but are laced with condescension. This is not accidental. This is a deliberate performance, a psychological defense mechanism that allows her to maintain a sense of identity even as her actions become increasingly monstrous. By framing her predation within the rituals of nobility, by calling her victims maidens, by treating their blood as wine, by conducting her hunts with the formality of aristocratic sport, she creates psychological distance between what she does and what it actually is. She's not murdering innocent women. She's maintaining her household. She's continuing a family tradition. She's being a proper lady of the manor. This is a form of dissociation, but not the kind where you lose awareness of your actions. Instead, it's a dissociation of meaning. The actions remain fully conscious and deliberate, but their moral weight is recontextualized through ritual and aesthetic. Psychologically, this allows her to commit atrocities without experiencing cognitive dissonance. She doesn't have to grapple with the horror of what she's doing because she's convinced herself and performs for others that what she's doing is simply what someone of her status does. This kind of psychological distancing through ritual is not unique to fiction. Throughout history, people who commit systematic violence often create elaborate frameworks to justify and aestheticize that violence, whether it's military ritual, religious ceremony, or in this case, aristocratic custom. The psychological function is the same: to transform acts that would be unbearable to contemplate as naked violence into something that feels structured, meaningful, even beautiful. Lady Dimitrescu's wine operation is the perfect example. She doesn't just kill women and drain their blood. She processes that blood into wine, bottles it, labels it with her family crest, and serves it at table. The entire operation is designed to look like legitimate viticulture. The aesthetic is so carefully maintained that if you walk through her cellars without knowing the truth, you might genuinely believe you were in a traditional winery. The barrels, the bottles, the tasting notes, all of it is meticulously crafted to resemble normalcy. This serves multiple psychological functions. First, it allows her to engage in the pretense that she's continuing a legitimate family business rather than running a slaughterhouse. Second, it reinforces her identity as a noble woman, someone who owns land, produces goods, maintains traditions. Third, it creates a sense of order and control in what is objectively a situation of complete moral chaos. By imposing structure and ritual onto horror, she makes it bearable. She makes it hers. But there's also something deeply sad about this performance, because underneath all the refinement, underneath the pearls and the gowns and the carefully curated aesthetic, Lady Dimitrescu knows what she is. She knows she's a monster. She knows that no amount of aristocratic posturing can change the fact that she's been fundamentally transformed into something inhuman. The performance of civility is not for others, it's for herself. It's the psychological armor she wears to avoid confronting the full horror of her existence. This becomes evident in moments when the mask slips. When she's frustrated or angry, her careful diction gives way to raw fury. When Ethan Winters kills one of her daughters, her composure shatters completely. Suddenly, the refined lady is gone, replaced by a grieving, rage filled creature screaming threats and obscenities. These moments reveal that the civility was always a thin veneer, a performance that requires constant effort to maintain. When that effort falters, what emerges is not refinement but primal emotion, grief, fury, desperation. Psychologically, this tells us that Lady Dimitrescu is living in a constant state of tension between who she wants to be and what she actually is. The performance of nobility is her attempt to cling to her pre transformation identity, to convince herself that she's still Alcina Dimitrescu, descendant of an ancient bloodline, rightful lady of this castle. But the reality is that she's Subject 181, a science experiment, a monster that exists solely because Mother Miranda needed test subjects. The disconnect between these two identities creates a psychological fragility that, when pressed, collapses catastrophically. The daughters, creation, control, and maternal obsession Lady Dimitrescu's relationship with her three daughters, Bela, Cassandra, and Daniela, is perhaps the most psychologically complex aspect of her character, because these are not her daughters in any biological sense. They are not women she gave birth to, not children she raised from infancy. They are constructs created through the same parasitic experimentation that transformed Dimitrescu herself, and their existence reveals profound truths about her psychology, her needs, and her desperate attempt to build something resembling a family from the wreckage of her humanity. The creation of the daughters is documented in notes found throughout the castle. At some point after her own transformation, Mother Miranda and Lady Dimitrescu brought three village women to Castle Dimitrescu. These women were incapacitated and then infected with the Cadou parasite, which laid eggs inside their bodies. When the eggs hatched, they produced swarms of shape-shifting blowflies that slowly consumed the women from the inside, devouring their flesh while absorbing their DNA. The flies then used that absorbed genetic material to coalesce into three humanoid forms, near perfect copies of the women they had just consumed, but animated by insect consciousness rather than human minds. This process is absolutely nightmarish. These women were essentially dissolved alive, their bodies transformed into raw material for creating something new. What emerged were not the original women, but simulacra, fly swarms wearing human skin, possessing the memories and appearances of their former hosts, but fundamentally different at a biological level. They are not alive in the conventional sense. They are colonies of insects operating collectively, maintaining human form through some function of the Cadou parasite's mutagenic properties. And Lady Dimitrescu looked at these three horrific constructs and decided they were her daughters. Let's sit with that for a moment, because the psychological implications are staggering. Dimitrescu knew exactly what these creatures were. She had participated in their creation. She had watched the process, understood the mechanics, knew that the women who entered the ritual were gone, and what remained were parasitic colonies puppeting corpse shells. And despite all of that, she chose to frame them as family. She gave them names: Bela, Cassandra, Daniela. She raised them, taught them, created spaces for them in her castle. She refers to them with genuine maternal affection, and her grief when they die is not performative. It's real, visceral, devastating. This tells us several crucial things about Lady Dimitrescu's psychological state. First, it reveals the depth of her isolation and loneliness. She's been alive for decades since her transformation, living in this castle with no genuine human connection. Miranda uses her, but doesn't love her. The village fears her, but doesn't accept her. She exists in complete social isolation, cut off from human society by her mutation and her needs. In that isolation, the need for family, for connection, for something resembling love, must have become overwhelming. Second, it demonstrates her capacity for self deception. On some level, she must know that these are not real daughters. She must understand that the maternal bond she feels is, to some degree, a construction, a story she's telling herself to fill the void in her existence. But she commits to the story completely. She performs motherhood with the same meticulous attention to detail that she performs nobility. She creates roles for them: Bela, the eldest and most tactical; Cassandra, the violent middle child; Daniela, the unhinged youngest. She gives them purposes, educates them in the family business, includes them in her hunts. She builds an entire family structure around creatures that are objectively monsters. But here's what makes this psychologically fascinating rather than simply delusional. The daughters reciprocate. They call her mother. They seek her approval. They compete for her attention. They express what appears to be genuine affection toward her. And when they hunt Ethan Winters, they do so not just out of sadistic pleasure, but also to protect their mother and avenge perceived slights against her. Whether this is genuine emotion or sophisticated mimicry is unclear, but functionally it doesn't matter. The relationship operates as a family unit. They have roles, dynamics, conflicts, and bonds that look and feel like family, even if the biology underlying it is parasitic horror. This creates a kind of mutual performance. Lady Dimitrescu performs motherhood, and the daughters perform being her children, and together they create something that functionally resembles a family unit. It's built on fiction and horror, but it's also the only genuine connection any of them have. For Lady Dimitrescu, this pseudo family becomes the center of her psychological world. They are proof that she's not just a monster. They are evidence that she can create, nurture, love. They allow her to be more than Subject 181, more than Miranda's experiment. With them, she can be mother, a role that carries its own form of identity and purpose. The daughters also serve another psychological function. They externalize aspects of Lady Dimitrescu's own suppressed emotions and impulses. Bela, with her calculated tactical approach, represents the controlled, strategic side of Dimitrescu's personality. Cassandra, with her explosive violence and sadistic pleasure in torment, represents the rage and cruelty that Dimitrescu usually keeps locked beneath her aristocratic veneer. Daniela, with her erratic, almost dreamlike behavior and romanticized fantasies, represents the parts of Dimitrescu that still long for beauty, for romance, for something beyond the endless cycle of predation. By creating daughters who embody different aspects of her own fractured psyche, Lady Dimitrescu essentially externalizes her internal conflicts. She can remain composed and refined because Cassandra can be violent. She can maintain her romantic notions about aristocratic life because Daniela can express that fantasy without irony. She can be strategically patient because Bella can enact that calculation without the burden of also being the authority figure. The daughters become psychological satellites, orbiting her and carrying pieces of her identity that she cannot fully integrate into her carefully maintained self image. This makes their death psychologically catastrophic. When Ethan Winters kills Bella, then Cassandra, then Daniela, he's not just eliminating threats, he's systematically dismantling Lady Dimitrescu's psychological architecture. Each death removes a piece of her externalized self. forces her to confront aspects of her own psyche that she'd been able to project onto her daughters. And more devastatingly, each death destroys the illusion that she's built a real family, that she's something more than a monster playing house with corpse puppets animated by flies. Her response to their deaths is not the refined anger of a noble woman. It's raw, primal grief. She screams, she threatens, she abandons all pretense of civility and transforms into her final mutated form, a massive dragon-like monstrosity covered in teeth and claws, her body expanding into something that can no longer even pretend to be human. This final transformation is not just physical, it's psychological surrender. It's Lady Dimitrescu admitting, through action, if not words, that without her daughters there's no point in maintaining the performance. Without them, she's just a monster. And if she's just a monster, she might as well embrace it completely. The tragedy is that this was always going to be the outcome. The daughters were created through violence and horror. They were never going to survive long term. Their bodies required specific conditions to remain stable, which is why cold air causes them to crystallize and shatter. They were fragile constructs masquerading as immortal beings, and Lady Dimitrescu must have known this on some level. She must have understood that her family was built on a foundation that could collapse at any moment, but she committed to the fiction anyway, because the alternative, accepting that she was utterly alone, that her transformation had severed her permanently from any possibility of genuine connection, was unbearable. In the end, her love for her daughters, however constructed and however horrific its origins, was the most human thing about her. It was the one aspect of her psychology that transcended monstrosity, that connected her to something recognizable as maternal devotion. And when that was taken from her, what remained was no longer Lady Dimitrescu, aristocrat and mother. What remained was just Subject 181, dying in the ruins of her castle, her performance finally over. Devotion to Mother Miranda, the psychology of worship. If Lady Dimitrescu's relationship with her daughters reveals her capacity for constructed love, her relationship with Mother Miranda reveals something far darker, her desperate need for validation from someone she can never truly reach. Throughout Resident Evil Village, we see glimpses of how the four lords interact with Miranda, and Lady Dimitrescu's behavior stands out as uniquely submissive, uniquely desperate for approval, uniquely willing to debase herself for even the smallest acknowledgement from the woman who gave her this cursed second life. Mother Miranda is functionally a cult leader. She's maintained control over the village and its surrounding region for over a century, positioning herself as a godlike figure to the locals while conducting horrific experiments in pursuit of resurrecting her dead daughter Ava. The four lords, Dimitrescu, Donna Beneviento, Salvatore Moreau, and Karl Heisenberg, are her most successful experiments, the only subjects who survived Cadou implantation with their cognition mostly intact. But Miranda doesn't treat them as successes. She treats them as tools, as failed vessels, as disappointments who continue to exist only because they serve some practical function in her plans. Lady Dimitrescu, despite her imposing presence and her absolute authority within her own castle, becomes almost childlike in Miranda's presence. The recordings and documents found throughout Village show her competing desperately for Miranda's attention, speaking about her with reverence, referring to her achievements in tones usually reserved for discussing divine miracles. When Miranda assigns her the task of guarding one of Rose Winter's body parts, the infant who Miranda believes can serve as a vessel for Eva's resurrection, Dimitrescu accepts with pride, treating the assignment as an honor rather than the manipulation it obviously is. This dynamic reveals something psychologically crucial. Lady Dimitrescu has transferred all of her need for validation, for purpose, for mattering onto Mother Miranda. Psychologically, this resembles what's known as transferred attachment, a pattern where someone redirects emotional needs that were originally meant for caregivers or significant others onto a new figure, often one who holds power over them. In trauma bonding, this attachment can become particularly intense when the powerful figure alternates between providing validation and withholding it, creating a psychological dependency where the subject becomes obsessed with earning approval. Miranda created Lady Dimitrescu in the most literal sense. She took a dying woman and transformed her into something that could survive. From Dimitrescu's perspective, Miranda didn't just save her life, she gave her a new existence, one with power and purpose after decades of decline and irrelevance. That's an overwhelming debt, psychologically speaking. It creates a situation where Dimitrescu feels she owes Miranda everything, where her entire post transformation existence is defined by gratitude and obligation. But Miranda doesn't want gratitude. She wants results. She's singularly focused on resurrecting Eva, and everyone and everything else is just a means to that end. She doesn't love her lords. She doesn't even particularly respect them. They're experiments that didn't quite fail, tools that have some remaining utility. This creates a devastating psychological dynamic. For Lady Dimitrescu, she's desperate for approval from someone who is fundamentally incapable of providing it in any meaningful way. The meetings between the four lords show this dynamic clearly. Dimitrescu preens, tries to demonstrate her competence, frames herself as the most reliable and sophisticated of the lords. She's dismissive of the others, calling Moreau a disgusting fool, treating Donna with barely concealed contempt, engaging in constant verbal sparring with Heisenberg. But all of this posturing is directed at an audience of one, Mother Miranda. Every insult toward the other lords is an attempt to elevate herself in Miranda's eyes. Every demonstration of competence is a bid for recognition. Every carefully chosen word is calculated to position herself as the favorite, the most worthy, the one who deserves Miranda's regard. And Miranda barely notices. She gives tasks, receives reports, and moves on. The emotional investment is entirely one-sided. Dimitrescu is desperate for maternal approval from a woman who sees her as a failed experiment, and that desperation is psychologically devastating because Lady Dimitrescu is too self-aware not to recognize it on some level. This creates an internal conflict. Part of her understands that Miranda doesn't love her, that this worship is unrequited, that she's degrading herself by competing for scraps of attention from someone who views her with clinical detachment at best. But she can't stop, because if she admits that Miranda doesn't care, then she has to confront the fact that her transformation, this existence as a monster that requires human blood to survive, was not some kind of gift or salvation. It was just an experiment. She's not special. She's Subject 181, one of hundreds who were infected, one of the tiny percentage who survived, notable only for her unusually high affinity with the parasite. That realization would destroy the narrative she's built around her existence, so she doesn't allow herself to fully acknowledge it. Instead, she commits harder to the worship, tells herself that if she just proves herself enough, if she just succeeds spectacularly enough, Miranda will finally see her worth. This is classic trauma bonding, the abused party escalating their attempts to please the abuser, convinced that the problem is their own inadequacy rather than the fundamental dysfunction of the relationship. The other lords have different responses to this dynamic. Moreau has internalized his worthlessness completely and exists in a state of constant self-loathing, punctuated by desperate bids for Miranda's attention. Donna has withdrawn almost entirely, communicating primarily through her doll, barely participating in the Lord's meetings. But Heisenberg has done something psychologically healthier. He's recognized that Miranda doesn't care about any of them and has begun actively working to overthrow her. His anger is directed outward at the appropriate target rather than inward at himself. Lady Dimitrescu's response falls between these extremes. She has an internalized worthlessness like Moreau, and she hasn't withdrawn like Donna, but she also hasn't achieved Heisenberg's clarity about the toxicity of the relationship. Instead, she remains locked in this pattern of seeking approval, of competing for recognition, of desperately trying to prove that she matters to someone who has made it abundantly clear through her indifference that she doesn't. This dynamic adds another layer to understanding her violence. The maidens she drains, the villagers she hunts, the casual cruelty she inflicts, all of it occurs within a context where she's simultaneously powerful and powerless. Within her castle, she's absolute authority. She decides who lives and dies. She controls every aspect of her domain. But in the larger structure of Miranda's organization, she's just another subordinate, just another experiment, just another tool. The violence she inflicts on those beneath her is, psychologically, a way of asserting the power she cannot assert in her relationship with Miranda. She can't control whether Miranda values her, but she can control everything within her castle walls. The cruelty becomes an outlet for the helplessness she feels in the one relationship that actually matters to her. When Ethan Winters invades her castle and kills her daughters, Lady Dimitrescu's first concern is not revenge, it's failure. She worries about what Mother Miranda will think. She's anxious about being seen as incompetent, about losing status in Miranda's eyes, about the possibility that this failure will confirm what she fears most, that she's not actually special, not actually worthy, not actually the favorite. Her rage at Ethan is genuine, but it's compounded by the terror of disappointing Miranda. She's not just grieving her daughters, she's terrified of being revealed as inadequate to the only person whose opinion she truly values. This makes her final transformation even more tragic. When she mutates into that dragon-like monstrosity, when she abandons all pretense of humanity and becomes pure rage and teeth and claws, she's already lost everything that mattered to her. Her daughters are dead, her castle is in ruins, and she's failed Mother Miranda. The transformation is surrender, not just of her human form, but of the entire psychological structure she'd built to make her existence bearable. Without Miranda's approval, without her daughters, without the performance of nobility, there's nothing left to hold on to. She's just a monster that was always going to die in these halls, and the final battle with Ethan is less about winning and more about making her death mean something, about taking someone down with her, about refusing to go quietly into the irrelevance she's always feared. Body horror and the loss of self. One of the most psychologically devastating aspects of Lady Dimitrescu's existence is the constant, ongoing horror of what's been done to her body. This is not a one-time transformation that she adjusted to and moved on from. This is a continuous state of biological wrongness that she must manage and navigate every single day, and while she performs composure and control, the reality of her physical existence is a daily negotiation with monstrosity. Let's be specific about what the Cadou parasite did to her. It stretched her body to 9.5 feet tall, elongating her bones and expanding her frame in ways that make her proportions subtly wrong when you look at her carefully. Her hands are massive, her fingers elongated, each nail filed into a talon capable of tearing through flesh. The elegant heels she wears aren't just fashion, they're necessary to balance her distorted frame. to allow her to move through spaces designed for normal-sized humans. Her body requires constant consumption of human blood to maintain stability, and without it, her regenerative abilities begin to fail and her mutations become uncontrollable. But the most horrifying aspect is her ability to arbitrarily control her transformation. She can extend her fingers into blade-like claws that stretch several feet. She can mutate her jaw, widening it to accommodate teeth that emerge like weapons. And in her final moments, when psychological control finally collapses, she transforms entirely into something that barely resembles the elegant noblewoman, a massive, winged, dragon-like creature covered in eyes and teeth and organic weaponry, her original form completely subsumed by the monster that was always lurking beneath. This ongoing negotiation between human and monster is psychologically exhausting. Every moment that Lady Dimitrescu maintains her composed, aristocratic appearance is an act of will. She's constantly suppressing the mutations that want to emerge, constantly controlling the transformations that the Cadou makes possible. This is not a stable state. It's a constant pushing back against her own biology, a never-ending effort to remain recognizable as human even though she fundamentally isn't anymore. Psychologically, this creates what we might call somatic dysphoria, a profound disconnect between the body you have and any sense of bodily integrity or comfort. This is different from body dysmorphia, where perception of the body is distorted. This is a situation where the body itself is objectively wrong, where it doesn't function according to human parameters, where it requires things that are morally abhorrent to obtain, and where its very structure is a constant reminder of lost humanity. Think about what it means to look in a mirror and see yourself stretched, distorted, fundamentally altered, to know that your body is being held together by a parasitic organism that without constant infusions of human blood, you'll degenerate into something even worse. To understand that you can never go back, that this is permanent, that every day for the rest of your unnaturally extended life, you will wake up as this thing that used to be Alcina Dimitrescu, but is now something else wearing her face. The psychological weight of that is almost incomprehensible, and yet she maintains her performance. She dresses elegantly, maintains her appearance, moves through her castle with practiced grace. This is not denial. She knows exactly what she is. This is a psychological survival mechanism. By performing humanity, by maintaining the aesthetics of her former life, she creates a barrier between herself and the full horror of her transformation. The performance becomes a kind of armor, a way of saying, I may be a monster, but I'm a civilized monster, a refined monster, a monster with standards. But the performance is constantly under threat from the reality of her body. When she's angry, her control slips, her fingers extend, her teeth show, her voice drops into something guttural and inhuman. These moments reveal that the composure is not natural. It's enforced, maintained through constant vigilance. The monster is always there, always pushing at the boundaries of her control, always ready to emerge when psychological defenses weaken. This makes her different from other Resident Evil monsters. The zombies and lichens have no awareness of what they've become. They don't remember being human. They don't mourn their lost selves. But Lady Dimitrescu remembers everything. She remembers being smaller, being weaker, being human. She remembers what it felt like to move through the world without having to duck through doorways, without having to calculate whether furniture will support her weight, without having to drain maidens like livestock to survive. That awareness is a curse. She can't escape into mindlessness. She has to live every day with full knowledge of what she's lost and what she's become. The blood requirement adds another layer of psychological horror. She doesn't just kill because she enjoys it, though the hunts clearly provide some twisted satisfaction. She kills because she has to. Her body demands it. Without blood, she'll die or transform into something even more monstrous. This removes the possibility of moral choice. She can't decide to be better, to stop killing, to find some other way. There is no other way. Her survival requires the death of others, and that requirement is built into her biology at such a fundamental level that resistance is impossible. This creates a form of moral injury, the psychological damage that occurs when you're forced to commit acts that violate your own ethical framework. Now, it's unclear how much ethical framework Lady Dimitrescu actually retains. She kills with apparent ease, with practiced efficiency, with sophisticated winemaking rituals that suggest she's long since rationalized the necessity. But there must have been a first time. There must have been a moment when she understood that this was her life now, that she would kill and drain and drink, and that this would continue until she finally died or was killed. That moment of realization, whenever it occurred, must have been psychologically catastrophic. It would have been the point where any remaining illusion of humanity collapsed completely. You can stretch yourself 9.5 feet tall and tell yourself you're still human. You can grow claws and tell yourself it's just a mutation. But when you drain your first victim, when you feel their life flowing into you and understand that this sustains you, that their death is your continuation, that's when you know you've crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. Lady Dimitrescu's response was to aestheticize the horror, to transform murder into harvest, blood into wine, predation into viticulture, by imposing the structures of aristocratic tradition onto biological necessity. She created psychological distance from what she was actually doing. This is sophisticated moral disengagement, not denying the act, but reframing it within a system of meaning that makes it feel acceptable, even noble. She's not a serial killer. She's a vintner. She's not draining victims. She's producing her family's wine. The language matters because it shapes how she conceptualizes her own actions. But the body knows what the mind refuses to fully acknowledge. And in moments of crisis, when control slips, the full horror emerges. Her final transformation is not an escalation of power. It's a collapse of all the psychological mechanisms she'd built to contain her monstrosity. The elegant lady dissolves, and what emerges is the truth. She's a dragon made of rage and hunger and parasitic mutation, a creature so far removed from humanity that the original woman is barely visible in the teeth and eyes and writhing flesh. That final form is psychologically significant because it represents what she was always suppressing: all the grace, all the refinement, all the carefully maintained aristocratic performance. It was a shell built over this. The dragon was always there. Lady Dimitrescu's entire existence was the effort to keep it contained, to live as if she were still the woman she used to be, rather than the monster she'd become. And when that effort finally failed, when the daughters died and the castle fell, and Mother Miranda's approval became permanently unattainable, there was no reason to maintain the performance anymore. The dragon could emerge, the truth could be acknowledged, and Alcina Dimitrescu could finally stop pretending. The castle as psychological extension. Castle Dimitrescu is not just a location in Resident Evil Village, it's a physical manifestation of Lady Dimitrescu's psychological state. Every room, every detail, every carefully maintained or deliberately neglected space tells us something about her internal world. The castle is her mind-made architecture, her trauma made stone, her desperate attempt at control made manifest in halls and chambers and locked doors. The most immediately striking thing about the castle is its aesthetic coherence. Unlike the other lords, domains, Beneviento's grief-soaked house of dolls, Moreau's rotting reservoir, Heisenberg's industrial factory of corpses, Castle Dimitrescu maintains an appearance of sophistication and order. The halls are clean. The art is displayed properly. The furniture is arranged with obvious care. Even the areas dedicated to wine production, which are objectively slaughterhouses, are organized with the precision of the legitimate viticulture. This coherence is psychological armor. It's Lady Dimitrescu imposing order onto chaos, maintaining the illusion that she's still a civilized being running a legitimate estate rather than a monster presiding over a murder factory. But look closer, and the cracks appear. The castle is enormous, far larger than any human-scale dwelling needs to be, with ceilings that stretch 2 stories high in places. This isn't historical architecture. This is space that's been modified, expanded, rebuilt to accommodate her transformed body. Every oversized doorway is a reminder that she doesn't fit in normal spaces anymore. Every unusually tall ceiling is evidence that the world of human proportion has become too small for her. The castle has been reshaped around her mutation, which means she can never forget what she's become. Every space she moves through has been altered to contain her, and that alteration is a constant physical reminder of her monstrosity. The dungeon level reveals what the upper floors hide. This is where the maidens are kept before they're harvested, where the bloody work of sustaining Lady Dimitrescu's existence actually happens. The cells are small, cramped, designed to contain rather than comfort. The hooks and chains suggest livestock management more than imprisonment, and the entire level has a different aesthetic, less refined, more functional, the mask of aristocracy discarded in favor of efficient brutality. Psychologically, this separation is crucial. By keeping the horror literally beneath the surface, by making sure the refined upper floors never show evidence of what happens below, Lady Dimitrescu maintains the cognitive separation between who she pretends to be and what she actually does. This is spatial dissociation, using physical space to mirror psychological compartmentalization. The elegant lady exists in the upper halls, surrounded by art and wine and fine furnishings. The monster exists in the basement, surrounded by cages and hooks and the implements of predation. As long as these spaces remain separate, as long as the blood is processed into wine before it reaches the dining room, she can maintain the fiction that she's still a noble woman running an estate. The moment those spaces blur, the moment the horror of the basement intrudes into the refinement of the upper halls, the entire psychological structure threatens to collapse. The daughter's rooms are particularly revealing. Each has been given her own space, decorated according to her personality and interests. These aren't generic guest rooms, they're personalized chambers that suggest years of accumulated belongings and individual development. Bella's room shows evidence of reading and study. Cassandra's contains weapons and trophies from hunts. Daniela's is filled with romantic imagery and fantasy. Lady Dimitrescu has invested significant psychological energy into creating spaces where her daughters can exist as individuals, where they can develop identities separate from their function as family members and hunters. This matters because it reveals her desperate need for these relationships to be real. If they were just tools, just weapons she'd created to help with security, she wouldn't bother with personalized rooms. She wouldn't care about their individual interests or their psychological development. The fact that she does care, that she's created spaces for them to be people rather than just extensions of her will, shows that she's committed completely to the fiction of family. And by extension, it shows how psychologically essential that fiction is to her continued functioning. Without the daughters, without the illusion that she's built something resembling a normal family life, the castle becomes what it actually is, a prison where a monster lives in isolation, sustained by murder, serving a master who doesn't love her. The opera hall is another psychologically significant space. It's enormous, ornate, designed for performance and spectacle. There's a stage, seating for an audience, acoustics that suggest someone once cared about how music would sound in this space. This is Lady Dimitrescu's past-made architecture, a physical reminder of when she was Miss D, when she sang for audiences, when she was valued for her art rather than her monstrosity. The hall is maintained but unused. No performances happen here anymore. It exists as a memorial to who she used to be, a space she can walk through and remember, however painfully, that she once had a life outside these walls. The fact that she's maintained this space rather than repurposing it or destroying it is psychologically revealing. It would be easier to remove the reminder, to eliminate the evidence of her former life, to fully commit to her current existence without these painful echoes of what she's lost, but she hasn't. The opera hall remains preserved like a shrine, which suggests that despite everything, despite the transformation, despite the decades of predation, despite the performance of aristocratic monstrosity, some part of her still mourns the woman who sang jazz. Some part of her refuses to let go of that identity completely, even though returning to it is impossible. The portrait gallery shows multiple generations of Dimitrescu family members, formal oil paintings displaying centuries of aristocratic lineage. Lady Dimitrescu's own portrait hangs among them, depicted as she appeared before her transformation, elegant, human sized, dressed in period appropriate clothing that suggests wealth and status. This portrait is aspirational rather than documentary. It shows her as she wants to be remembered, as she wants to think of herself, rather than as she actually is. And the fact that she's placed herself in this gallery, positioned her transformed self as a continuation of this noble lineage rather than as a break from it, reveals her desperate need to maintain connection to her pre-transformation identity. But there's something tragic about these portraits, because they're evidence of a family line that's now permanently ended. Lady Dimitrescu cannot have biological children. Her body doesn't work that way anymore. The daughters are constructs, not heirs. The Dimitrescu bloodline, which these portraits document spanning centuries, ends with her. She's the last one, and she knows it. Every time she walks past these portraits, she's confronted with the reality that her transformation didn't just change her body, it ended her family's genetic continuity. She's a dead end, literally and figuratively. The noble lineage she's so desperate to embody and continue will die when she does. This makes the castle's meticulous maintenance even more poignant. She's preserving a legacy that has no future. She's maintaining traditions that will die with her. She's performing nobility for an audience that doesn't exist and never will. The entire structure is a monument to denial, to refusal to accept the finality of what's been lost. As long as the castle stands, as long as she maintains the wine production and the aristocratic aesthetics and the performance of continuity, she can pretend that the Dimitrescu line continues, that she's not the ending, but just another generation in an ongoing story. But Ethan Winter's invasion reveals the fragility of this structure. As he moves through the castle, killing the daughters, destroying the wine operation, burning paintings, and breaking furniture in his desperate attempts to survive, he's not just escaping, he's dismantling Lady Dimitrescu's entire psychological architecture. Each destroyed room is a piece of her identity, obliterated. Each killed daughter is a relationship annihilated. By the time he reaches her, the castle is already ruined, the carefully maintained illusion shattered beyond repair. And without that structure, without the physical spaces that mirrored her psychological defenses, Lady Dimitrescu has nothing left to contain the monster she's been suppressing for decades. Her final transformation happens in the ruins of her own castle, surrounded by the wreckage of everything she'd built to make her existence bearable. The elegant halls are burned, the art is destroyed, the daughters are dead, the wine cellars are contaminated. There's nothing left to preserve, nothing left to maintain, nothing left to perform for. And so the performance ends, and the dragon emerges, and Lady Dimitrescu dies as what she's always been underneath the pearls and the gowns and the carefully maintained aristocratic veneer. A monster created by someone else's ambition, sustained by horror, collapsing finally in the ruins of a life that was never truly hers to begin with. Tragedy and the impossibility of redemption. Here's where we need to sit with something uncomfortable. Lady Dimitrescu is simultaneously a victim and a perpetrator, someone who suffered profound violation, and someone who inflicts that violation onto countless others. Understanding her psychological complexity doesn't mean excusing her actions. She's murdered dozens, possibly hundreds of women. She's transformed human beings into wine. She's created daughters through a process that required dissolving village women alive. These are not morally neutral acts, they're atrocities, and the fact that she performs them with aristocratic grace doesn't make them less horrific. But her victimhood is also real. She didn't ask for the Cadou parasite. She was dying, desperate, and someone with significant power over her, someone she trusted because she had no other choice, infected her with something that fundamentally rewrote her biology. The transformation wasn't consensual in any meaningful sense. You can't give meaningful consent when your alternative is death, when you're in a position of complete powerlessness, when the person offering the choice has absolute authority over your continued existence. Mother Miranda took advantage of Lady Dimitrescu's vulnerability and transformed her into something that serves Miranda's purposes, rather than Dimitrescu's own desires. The blood requirement wasn't something Lady Dimitrescu chose. It was imposed on her by her mutation's interaction with her hereditary disease. She didn't wake up one day and decide she wanted to drink human blood. She woke up needing it, her body demanding it, her survival contingent on committing acts she might never have chosen if given a real alternative. That's violation. That's having your agency removed at the most fundamental biological level. She can't choose not to kill any more than a human can choose not to breathe. The choice was removed from her the moment the Cadou took hold, and yet, she kills with efficiency and apparent satisfaction. She's developed elaborate rituals around the predation. She's aestheticized the horror. She hunts maidens through her castle with what appears to be genuine pleasure, toying with them, terrorizing them, making their deaths theatrical rather than simply efficient. This suggests that while the need to kill might be imposed, the manner of killing is chosen. She could drain blood quickly, minimally traumatically, treating it as an unfortunate biological necessity. Instead, she's created an entire culture of predation, involving her daughters, turning murder into family bonding, transforming necessity into sport. This is where victimhood and monstrosity intersect in ways that resist easy categorization. Lady Dimitrescu has been violated, transformed, enslaved to biological needs she never chose, and within the constraints of that violation, she's chosen to embrace monstrosity rather than resist it. She's made the suffering of others into entertainment. She's built an identity around being an apex predator. She's taken what was done to her and redirected it outward, making her pain into others' terror. Psychologically, this might be understood as identification with the aggressor, a defense mechanism where victims adopt characteristics of their abusers as a way of managing trauma. By becoming the source of terror rather than its recipient, by taking on the role of powerful predator rather than remaining in the position of victim, Lady Dimitrescu transforms her relationship to trauma. She's no longer the woman who was dying and desperate and transformed against her will. She's Lady Dimitrescu, lord of this castle, feared throughout the region, powerful and terrible and in control. But this transformation doesn't heal the original wound, it just creates new ones. She's built an identity around monstrosity because that was the only identity available to her after transformation. But that identity requires constant reinforcement through violence. Every maiden she drains, every hunt she conducts, every performance of aristocratic predation is an attempt to prove to herself that she's chosen this, that she's powerful, that she's not the victim anymore. But the desperation underlying it all, the need for Miranda's approval, the constructed family, the meticulous maintenance of a castle that's really just a very elaborate cage, reveals that she's never escaped victimhood. She's just performing its opposite with increasing desperation, while the original wound continues to fester underneath. This is what makes her irredeemable in practical terms, even if she's comprehensible in psychological ones. Too much harm has been done, too many people have died. The girl who wanted to sing jazz is still somewhere in there, buried under decades of mutation and violence and desperate performance. But she's been so subsumed by the monster that extraction is impossible. There's no therapy that can address this. There's no healing process that can undo what's been done to her body and psyche. There's no path to redemption because redemption requires the possibility of change. And Lady Dimitrescu's biology makes change impossible. She will always need blood. She will always be a monster. And the sophisticated psychological structures she's built to make that bearable don't change the fundamental reality. This is the real tragedy. Not that she became a monster. Monsters are common enough in Resident Evil's universe. The tragedy is that she became a monster who remembers being human, who mourns that lost humanity, who builds elaborate psychological defenses to avoid confronting what she's become, and who dies knowing that she never had a real chance at being anything else. Mother Miranda decided her fate decades ago. Everything that followed, the daughters, the castle, the wine, the performance of nobility, was just elaborate decoration on a life that was never really hers to direct. When Ethan finally kills her, when her mutated dragon form collapses into calcification and death, there's no redemption arc. There's no moment of recognition where she apologizes or expresses regret. She just dies, a monster killed by someone desperately trying to save his daughter, and the castle falls silent around her corpse. Her legacy is terror, murder, and the wine she made from human suffering. The woman who sang jazz is gone. The noble woman who might have been something other than a predator is gone. All that remains is Subject 181, dead in the ruins of a castle that was really just a very ornate tomb where she'd been slowly dying for decades anyway. The mirror of immortality, time, and stagnation, one aspect of Lady Dimitrescu's psychology that deserves careful examination is the temporal dimension of her existence. The fact that she's been alive for decades since her transformation, experiencing time in a way that fundamentally differs from normal human experience. This extended lifespan, granted by the Cadou parasite's regenerative properties, is often framed as a gift in vampire mythology. immortality, eternal youth, the ability to watch centuries pass while you remain unchanged. But for Lady Dimitrescu, this extended existence is less a gift and more a curse that traps her in a psychological prison with no possibility of escape. Consider what it means to be psychologically frozen. When Lady Dimitrescu was transformed, she was in her early 40s, suffering from a blood disease, recently returned to her ancestral homeland after years away. That was her psychological state at the moment of transformation, a woman in crisis, desperate, clinging to anything that might offer salvation. And then the Cadou took hold, and that moment of desperation was essentially preserved. She survived, yes, her body was transformed into something powerful and resilient, but her psychological development stopped. In normal human development, people continue growing and changing throughout their lives. Experiences accumulate, perspectives shift, old traumas are processed or at least integrated into a more complex understanding of self. Even people who experience severe trauma in their 40s continue developing psychologically afterward. They're changed by the trauma, certainly, but they don't remain frozen at the moment of violation. Time provides distance. New experiences provide context. The self continues evolving even as it carries the weight of what came before. But Lady Dimitrescu doesn't get that progression. Her existence after transformation is not characterized by growth or change. It's characterized by repetition. The same castle, the same halls, the same hunts, the same wine production, the same desperate attempts to please Mother Miranda. Year after year, decade after decade, nothing fundamentally changes. The daughters are created at some point, which introduces new relationships, but even those relationships quickly settle into patterns that repeat endlessly. Bela remains the calculating eldest. Cassandra remains the violent middle child. Daniela remains the romantic youngest. The dynamics are established and then maintained without significant evolution. This is psychological stagnation on a scale that's difficult to comprehend. Imagine being trapped not just in the same physical location, but in the same psychological state for decades. The same needs, the same fears, the same desperate hunger for approval from someone who will never provide it, the same performance of nobility covering the same monstrous reality, the same awareness that you're trapped in this existence with no possibility of escape except death, and all of this happening while your body doesn't age, while time passes but you remain essentially unchanged, while the world outside continues evolving, but your internal world remains fixed at the moment of your greatest vulnerability. This creates what we might call temporal dysphoria, a profound disconnect between your subjective experience of time and the objective passage of years. For most people, the passage of time is marked by change. You look back at who you were 10 years ago and recognize growth, development, shifts in perspective and priority. But for Lady Dimitrescu, looking back 10 years reveals essentially the same existence, the same castle, the same routine, the same psychological struggles. The passage of time becomes meaningless because it doesn't bring change. It just brings more of the same, endlessly, until the monotony becomes its own form of torture. This might explain some of her aesthetic obsessiveness, the meticulous maintenance of the castle, the careful curation of art and wine, the elaborate rituals around hunting and feeding. These aren't just about maintaining appearances. They're about creating the illusion of meaning in an existence that has become fundamentally meaningless. When nothing changes, when every day is essentially identical to the one before, ritual becomes crucial. It provides structure, creates the sense that actions matter, that time is being marked by something other than its own empty passage. But ritual can only do so much. Underneath the performance, there's a kind of existential despair that Lady Dimitrescu can never fully escape. She's immortal in the sense that she won't die of natural causes, but she's not actually living. She's trapped in a state of perpetual crisis, her psychological development arrested at the moment of transformation, repeating the same patterns endlessly because there's no mechanism for growth or change. The woman who wanted to be a jazz singer is still in there somewhere, still mourning the loss of that possibility, but she can't move past that grief because moving past requires psychological development, and psychological development requires the kind of new experiences and perspectives that her trapped existence makes impossible. The daughters might have represented a hope for change, for new relationship dynamics that could disrupt the stagnation. And perhaps they did briefly when they were first created. New people to interact with, new relationships to navigate, new purposes to fulfill as a mother rather than just as Miranda's subordinate. But relationships can only provide so much novelty before they too settle into patterns. And without external change, without new experiences or challenges beyond the endless repetition of hunt, feed, serve, Miranda, even the daughters eventually become part of the stagnant routine rather than a disruption of it. This temporal imprisonment makes Ethan Winter's arrival psychologically significant beyond just the immediate threat he represents. He's something genuinely new, a variable that doesn't fit the established patterns. For the first time in possibly decades, something unexpected has happened in Castle Dimitrescu. The routine has been disrupted, and Lady Dimitrescu's response, her rage, her obsessive pursuit, her eventual complete psychological collapse, is disproportionate to the actual threat Ethan poses precisely because he represents the destruction of the only thing that's been holding her together, the predictable, ritualized structure of her existence. When he kills the daughters, when he destroys the wine operation, when he forces her to confront the fragility of everything she's built, he's not just threatening her life. He's revealing that the meaning she's constructed through decades of ritual and performance was always illusory, that the stagnant existence she's been trapped in was never actually sustainable, that the psychological defenses she's relied on were always one disruption away from total collapse, and that realization, that moment when she understands that nothing she's built can survive genuine change, is what finally breaks her completely. Her final transformation into the dragon form is surrender, not just to physical mutation, but to psychological truth. There's no point in maintaining the performance anymore. The castle is destroyed. The daughters are dead. The routine that gave her existence structure is shattered. And underneath all of that, exposed and undeniable, is the reality she's been avoiding for decades. She's been dead this entire time. Not literally in the way Ethan Winters is unknowingly dead in his games, but psychologically dead, frozen at the moment of transformation, incapable of growth or change, repeating the same patterns in an elaborate denial of the fact that her actual life ended the moment the Cadou entered her body. Everything since has just been an animated corpse, going through motions, performing existence rather than living it. The tragedy of immortality, at least as Lady Dimitrescu experiences it, is that it's not actually life extension, it's death postponement. She's been dying this entire time, slowly, across decades, her psychological self eroding under the weight of endless repetition and stagnation. The physical death Ethan delivers is almost a mercy, not because she deserves mercy in any moral sense, but because it finally ends an existence that stopped being genuinely alive decades ago. Class, power, and the aristocratic mask. We need to examine the specific psychological function of Lady Dimitrescu's aristocratic identity because it's not just aesthetic flavor, it's a core component of how she structures her understanding of herself and her actions. The performance of nobility, the constant invocation of class and bloodline, the elaborate maintenance of aristocratic traditions. These are psychological load bearing structures. Remove them, and the entire edifice of her identity collapses. Aristocracy, historically, is about more than just wealth or property ownership. It's about a fundamental belief in natural hierarchy, in the idea that some people are inherently superior to others by virtue of birth and bloodline. Aristocratic ideology positioned nobility not as an arbitrary social construction but as a reflection of genuine inherent difference. Noble blood is different from common blood. Noble families have been elevated through centuries of breeding and tradition into something categorically distinct from the peasantry. And with that distinctness comes not just privilege but responsibility, the obligation to rule, to govern, to make decisions for those beneath you who are incapable of governing themselves. This ideology is obviously a self serving fiction that aristocratic classes develop to justify their own power. But for people raised within aristocratic systems, it's not experienced as fiction, it's experienced as truth, as the fundamental nature of reality, as the proper and natural order of the world. And Lady Dimitrescu was raised in this system. She was born into a family that had maintained noble status for centuries. She was taught from childhood that she was different, that her blood carried something special, that her position above others was not just social circumstance but natural law. When she transforms into a monster, when she's infected with the Cadou, and her body mutates into something that requires human blood to survive, this aristocratic framework becomes psychologically crucial, because without it, she's just a serial killer. She's just a monster that murders people to sustain itself. But with the aristocratic framework, she can reconceptualize predation as something else entirely. She's not murdering people, she's exercising her noble prerogative. The maidens aren't victims, they're resources, essentially livestock, existing in her service as is the natural order. Their blood isn't stolen, it's claimed, taken by right of her superior position in the hierarchy. This is how aristocratic ideology functions psychologically. It transforms exploitation into entitlement, violence into governance, hierarchy into natural law. And Lady Dimitrescu uses this framework with sophisticated precision. The wine operation isn't a cover for murder, it's a legitimate family business, the continuation of Dimitrescu traditions, the proper use of resources that exist within her domain. The maidens aren't kidnapped villagers, they're servants fulfilling their function in her household. Her consumption of their blood isn't predation, it's the exercise of noble privilege, taking what is hers by right of birth and station. This reframing is psychologically essential for her continued functioning. It allows her to commit atrocities while maintaining a self image as a civilized, even noble individual. It creates a moral framework where her actions make sense, where they're not just permissible but appropriate, even admirable in their maintenance of tradition and order. And it connects her present monstrous existence to her past human identity. She's still a Dimitrescu, still nobility, still maintaining the family legacy, even if the methods have changed somewhat due to unfortunate biological necessities. But here's what makes this psychologically fascinating. Lady Dimitrescu knows it's a performance. She has to know. She's too intelligent, too self aware, too educated not to recognize that the aristocratic order she's claiming to uphold doesn't actually exist anymore. The social structures that gave nobility meaning have collapsed. There are no peasants paying fealty. There's no king granting legitimacy to her title. The world has moved on from the rigid class hierarchies of pre-war Europe. Her claim to nobility is essentially a LARP, a costume she wears while committing murder in a castle that's functionally just a very large tomb. But admitting that would destroy the psychological framework she's built her identity around. So she doesn't admit it. She commits fully to the performance, speaks as if the aristocratic order still exists, treats the village as if it's still her domain, refers to herself as Lady Dimitrescu, with the expectation that the title means something beyond just a word. This is a kind of psychotic break, not psychotic in the clinical sense of losing touch with reality, but psychotic in the sense of maintaining a delusion because the alternative is psychological annihilation. The delusion is that she matters, that her bloodline means something, that she's not just subject 181, an experiment that happened to survive, but Lady Alcina Dimitrescu, descendant of an ancient and noble house, rightful owner of this castle and the land surrounding it. The performance of nobility is how she maintains that delusion. As long as she speaks correctly, dresses appropriately, maintains the aesthetic standards of her class, she can pretend that the social structures that once legitimized her identity still exist. As long as she treats the maidens as servants rather than victims, she can pretend that the hierarchy that once positioned her above others is still in force. But the performance requires constant maintenance. Any crack in the facade threatens the entire structure. This is why she's so obsessed with appearances, why the castle must be immaculate, why the wine must be produced according to proper procedures, why even her murders must follow certain aesthetic standards. She's not maintaining a castle, she's maintaining a psychological defense mechanism. The moment the appearance falters, the moment the aesthetic breaks down, the underlying reality becomes visible. She's a monster in a decaying building, killing people to survive, serving someone who doesn't love her, trapped in an existence that has no actual meaning or purpose beyond perpetuating itself. Ethan Winters, significantly, doesn't respect the performance at all. He doesn't call her Lady Dimitrescu. He barely acknowledges her title. He doesn't treat her with the deference she expects. He's not intimidated by the castle's grandeur or impressed by her aristocratic bearing. He treats her like what she is, an obstacle between him and his daughter, something to be overcome or destroyed. And that disrespect is psychologically devastating to her because it reveals the truth. Outside the castle walls, her performance means nothing. The aristocratic identity she's clung to so desperately is completely unrecognizable to someone from the modern world. She's cosplaying nobility for an audience of one, herself, and when confronted with someone who doesn't even recognize the costume, the entire performance is revealed as hollow. This is why her rage at Ethan is so personal, so visceral. He's not just threatening her life, he's invalidating her identity. He's treating her as if she's nothing special, as if her bloodline and title and centuries of heritage are irrelevant, and they are irrelevant objectively speaking. But Lady Dimitrescu has built her entire psychological framework around the idea that they're everything, that they're what separates her from common monstrosity, what gives her existence meaning and purpose beyond simple predation. Ethan's refusal to acknowledge that framework is, in its way, more threatening than his physical attacks. He's destroying her not just physically but existentially, proving through his indifference that the identity she's performed for decades is meaningless to anyone but herself. The psychology of consumption. Let's examine the specific act that defines Lady Dimitrescu's existence, the consumption of human blood, not metaphorically, not as some kind of symbolic representation, but the actual physical act of draining maidens and drinking their blood. Because this isn't just biological necessity, it's psychologically loaded in ways that reveal profound truths about her character and her relationship to her own monstrosity. Blood consumption in vampire mythology has always carried sexual and intimate connotations. The penetration of us fangs, the exchange of fluids, the vulnerability of the victim, the intimacy of the act. All of this has been coded as transgressive sexuality since vampire fiction emerged as a genre. And while Resident Evil Village doesn't explicitly sexualize Lady Dimitrescu's feeding, the undertones are undeniably present. The maidens are young women. The castle has a distinctly feminine energy. The daughters participate in the hunts with evident pleasure. There's a predatory homoeroticism in how Lady Dimitrescu moves through her domain, selecting victims, orchestrating their fates. But more than sexuality, blood consumption represents a fundamental violation of bodily autonomy. When Lady Dimitrescu drains a maiden, she's not just taking blood, she's taking life itself. Blood is the physical substance that carries oxygen, nutrients, everything necessary for biological function. To drain someone of blood is to literally drain them of the capacity to exist. It's one of the most intimate forms of murder possible, requiring physical proximity, time, the victim's consciousness of what's happening. You can't drain someone's blood quickly and impersonally. It requires presence, contact, awareness. And Lady Dimitrescu does this repeatedly, routinely, with enough frequency to sustain not just herself, but her daughters, and a wine operation that appears to have been running for years. The psychological weight of that repetition is extraordinary. This isn't a desperate act of survival done once in crisis. This is systematic predation, organized and ritualized, transformed into a business model. She's industrialized murder, created supply chains around it, turned the violation and death of human beings into a renewable resource that she harvests with the same casual efficiency that normal vintners harvest grapes. What kind of psychological state does that require? You can't maintain empathy for your victims and also drain them systematically. Empathy would make the act unbearable. You'd feel their terror, their pain, their desperate will to live, and that feeling would create overwhelming psychological distress. So empathy has to be suppressed or eliminated. The victims have to be reconceptualized as something other than full human beings with their own subjectivity, their own hopes and fears and loved ones. They have to become objects, resources, things rather than people. This is dehumanization, one of the most dangerous psychological mechanisms humans are capable of. It's how genocide happens, how slavery is justified, how systematic violence becomes psychologically tolerable to those perpetrating it. You redefine the victims as categorically different, as less than fully human, as not deserving of the moral consideration you'd extend to real people. And once that redefinition is accepted, once the victims have been successfully dehumanized, extraordinary cruelty becomes possible without the psychological cost it would otherwise exact. Lady Dimitrescu has accomplished this dehumanization completely. The maidens aren't people to her, they're a resource she's entitled to. Their fear doesn't evoke compassion, it's part of the hunt, the sport that makes consumption interesting rather than just necessary. Their deaths don't cause guilt, they're expected outcomes, the inevitable result of fulfilling their function in her household. She's created a psychological framework where systematic murder becomes not just acceptable but mundane, routine, barely worth remarking on. But dehumanization is never complete. There are always cracks where the humanity of the victims reasserts itself, where the perpetrator is forced to recognize what they're actually doing. For Lady Dimitrescu, those cracks appear in how she talks about her prey. She doesn't use clinical, distant language. She doesn't refer to maidens as inventory or resources or other terms that would create maximum psychological distance. Instead, she uses intimate language. My daughters and I will devour your flesh. You will know suffering. I'll have your head on a pike. This is personal. This is engaged. This suggests that she hasn't achieved complete psychological separation from her victims, which means part of her still recognizes them as human. Part of her still understands that what she's doing is murder, is violation, is the destruction of people who have their own subjective experiences and don't want to die. And that recognition, however suppressed, must create ongoing psychological distress, because you can't fully acknowledge the humanity of your victims and also systematically kill them without experiencing severe moral injury. The two positions are incompatible. This might explain her need for the aristocratic performance. It's not just about maintaining class identity, it's about creating a moral framework where the recognition of her victims' humanity can coexist with her need to kill them. Aristocratic ideology says that noble people are fundamentally different from common people, that the noble have the right and even the obligation to use common people as resources. If Lady Dimitrescu can maintain that framework, can convince herself that it's true, then she can recognize the maidens as human while still killing them. They're human, but they're common humans, and she's nobility. And the hierarchy makes their deaths not just permissible but appropriate. But that framework is always under threat from reality. The maidens don't behave like willing servants fulfilling their natural function. They're terrified. They try to escape. They beg for their lives. They behave, in other words, like people who understand they're being murdered and desperately want to survive. Their resistance exposes the fiction of the aristocratic framework. If they truly belonged to a lower order that naturally accepted noble authority, they wouldn't resist. Their resistance proves their people asserting their own humanity, their own right to exist against Lady Dimitrescu's attempt to reduce them to resources. And Lady Dimitrescu responds to that resistance with rage, not just the practical frustration of prey escaping, but genuine fury at their refusal to accept their role. How dare they run? How dare they resist? How dare they refuse to submit to the natural order? This rage reveals the psychological fragility of her position. If she were truly comfortable with what she is, truly convinced of her right to kill them, their resistance wouldn't anger her. It would just be expected behavior that she'd counter with whatever force necessary. But she's not comfortable. She's maintaining a precarious psychological balance, and their resistance threatens it by forcing her to confront what she's doing without the protective framework of aristocratic justification. The wine production is her attempt to transform this psychological distress into something manageable. By processing blood into wine, by creating a product that has its own aesthetic and cultural significance, she distances herself from the raw act of killing. She's not a murderer, she's a vintner. She's not draining victims, she's producing her family's traditional wine using traditional methods. The transformation of blood into wine is alchemical in the psychological sense. It transmutes the base horror of murder into something that can be appreciated, discussed, even celebrated. But the transmutation is never complete. The wine still tastes like blood because it is blood. The process still requires killing because you can't produce blood wine without blood sources. And Lady Dimitrescu still has to confront every time she drinks that she's consuming the life force of someone who wanted to live and was denied that continuation because she needed their blood more than they did. That's an impossible psychological burden to carry without massive defense mechanisms. And her defense mechanisms, the aristocratic performance, the aesthetic ritualization, the dehumanization of victims, are sophisticated and elaborate precisely because the act they're defending against is so profoundly horrible. This is why her final transformation is so significant. When she abandons the human form entirely, when she becomes the dragon, she's also abandoning all the psychological mechanisms she's used to make consumption tolerable. The dragon doesn't need justification. It doesn't need aristocratic frameworks, or wine production, or careful performance. It's just a creature of appetite and rage, consuming and destroying without the burden of moral consideration. In becoming the dragon, Lady Dimitrescu achieves a kind of terrible freedom, freedom from the psychological weight of recognizing her victim's humanity, freedom from the constant effort of maintaining justifications, freedom from the cognitive dissonance of being both a refined lady and a systematic murderer. She becomes, finally, what she's always been underneath, a monster that kills, pure and simple without the complication of retained human consciousness. The final moments collapse and calcification. When Lady Dimitrescu transforms into her final draconic form after Ethan kills her last daughter, something fundamental shifts in her psychology. This isn't just a power up in video game terms, it's a complete abandonment of everything she's been using to maintain her identity. The performance of humanity ends, the aristocratic mask shatters, the careful control over her mutations collapses. What emerges is the truth that's been building throughout the entire encounter. She's been one moment away from this collapse the entire time, and it's taken every ounce of psychological and physical control to prevent it. The dragon form is massive, easily filling the entire tower space where the final confrontation occurs. It's covered in eyes, not metaphorical eyes, but actual functioning eyes embedded throughout its flesh, creating the horrifying impression that every part of her is watching, that consciousness has spread throughout the mutated mass rather than remaining localized in a single head. The mouth is enormous, lined with teeth that look organic and wrong. Wings sprout from the back, massive and membrane-like, suggesting both bat and insect anatomy. There are echoes of her human form in the structure. You can identify where her arms used to be, where her torso has expanded, but they're distorted beyond recognition, stretched and mutated into something that barely resembles human anatomy. This form represents what she's been suppressing for decades. The Cadou parasite has always had the capacity to transform her into something this monstrous. The dragon was always possible, always lurking beneath the carefully maintained human appearance, always threatening to emerge if her control faltered, and she's prevented it through sheer force of will, through the psychological mechanisms we've discussed, the performance of nobility, the ritualization of predation, the creation of family, the devotion to Miranda. All of these structures were holding the dragon back, creating a psychological cage that kept the mutations under control. But structures break, and when Ethan kills Daniela, when the last daughter falls and Lady Dimitrescu's constructed family is completely destroyed, the final load-bearing pillar of her psychological architecture collapses. There's nothing left to fight for, nothing left to maintain, nothing left to perform. The castle is in ruins. The daughters are dead. Mother Miranda's approval is now permanently unattainable because she's failed in her most basic responsibility, protecting the family and the domain she was supposed to maintain. Without those anchors, without those reasons to maintain human form, the mutations that have always been fighting to expand finally succeed. The transformation is surrender. It's Lady Dimitrescu, acknowledging that she can't maintain the performance anymore, can't hold the pieces together, can't continue pretending that she's anything other than what she actually is. And what she actually is, when all the pretense is stripped away, is this: a massive, monstrous creature held together by parasitic biology, driven by rage and hunger, and the simple imperative to destroy the thing that's caused all this pain. But here's what's psychologically devastating. Even in the dragon form, she's still conscious. She's still Alcina Dimitrescu in there somewhere, aware of what she's become, aware that this final transformation represents the complete annihilation of everything she's tried to preserve. The eyes covering her body aren't just for intimidation, they suggest distributed consciousness, that every part of this creature is aware, is watching, is experiencing the horror of existence in this form. She hasn't escaped into mindlessness. She's trapped in full awareness inside a body that's become completely monstrous, unable to speak, unable to perform humanity, unable to do anything but rage and attack until either Ethan dies or she does. This is body horror at its most psychologically brutal. Not the transformation itself, but the awareness during the transformation. The knowledge that you're losing the last remnants of human form, that the body you've been desperately controlling is finally escaping your control completely, and there's nothing you can do but experience it happening. Every moment in the dragon form must be psychological agony, not physical pain, but existential anguish at the complete dissolution of self. She's watching her own final degradation from inside it, fully conscious and helpless to stop it. When Ethan finally defeats her, when enough damage accumulates that the Cadou's regenerative abilities finally fail, she doesn't die immediately. Instead, she calcifies, her flesh literally turning to stone, the organic material crystallizing and becoming inert. This calcification is what happens to Cadou-infected organisms when they're killed, a side effect of how the parasite interacts with human biology, but it's also symbolically perfect for Lady Dimitrescu. She's been trying to preserve herself, to maintain a fixed identity against the changing circumstances of her existence, to become something permanent and lasting despite being made of flesh and horror. And in death, she achieves that permanence. She becomes literally crystallized, literally frozen in stone, the ultimate preservation, but also the ultimate death. Her calcified corpse remains there in the tower, a monument to failed performance, to the impossibility of maintaining humanity when your biology has been rewritten into monstrosity, to the tragic reality that all the aristocratic posturing and careful aesthetics and elaborate psychological defenses couldn't change what she fundamentally was: a woman who was transformed against her will, who built an entire existence trying to make that transformation mean something, and who died when the meaning finally collapsed. There's no redemption in her death, no moment of clarity where she realizes the horror of what she's done and expresses regret, no tearful reconciliation or acknowledgement of her victims. She dies as she lived, as a monster, fighting desperately to destroy someone who represents a threat to the structure she built to make her existence bearable. The woman who sang jazz is long gone. The noble woman performing aristocracy dies with the dragon. What remains is just stone, crystallized flesh, a corpse that will eventually crumble to dust, leaving no trace that Alcina Dimitrescu ever existed, except perhaps some entries in Mother Miranda's research notes documenting Subject 181's unusual compatibility with the Cadou parasite, legacy, and the architecture of horror. What remains after examining Lady Dimitrescu's psychology so thoroughly? What do we understand about her that we didn't understand before breaking down the mechanisms, The traumas, the performances, the desperate structures she built to maintain some sense of self in circumstances that denied the possibility of genuine selfhood, we understand that she's a tragedy. Not in the sense that we should sympathize with her. Again, she murdered countless people, transformed human beings into wine, created daughters through processes that required dissolving women alive. Her actions are indefensible, and her victimhood doesn't erase that. But she's a tragedy in the sense that she's someone who was given impossible choices and made understandable, if horrific, decisions in response to those choices. Die of a blood disease in a crumbling castle, or accept transformation from someone who promised survival but delivered monstrosity. Those were her options. She chose survival, and survival required becoming something that couldn't exist without causing harm to others. We understand that performance can be both mask and prison. Lady Dimitrescu's aristocratic identity was a psychological defense mechanism that allowed her to function, but it was also a cage that prevented any genuine development or growth. She couldn't move past the moment of transformation because she was too busy performing continuity with her pre transformation life. The elaborate rituals, the aesthetic maintenance, the careful control, all of it was designed to create the illusion that she was still the same person, still the noble woman she'd been raised to be, when the reality was that the Cadou had created something fundamentally new. She could have potentially developed a new identity, found new meaning, but that would have required acknowledging the death of her old self, and that acknowledgement was psychologically unbearable. We understand that family, even constructed family, built on horror, can still function psychologically as family. The daughters were monstrous constructs, colonies of flies wearing human skin, but they also fulfilled genuine psychological needs for Lady Dimitrescu. They gave her purpose beyond serving Miranda. They created relationships that felt real, that operated with the dynamics and emotions of actual family bonds. The love she felt for them, however impossible and horrific its origins, was genuine in its psychological function, and their loss was genuinely devastating. Not because they were valuable tools, but because they were the only meaningful connection she had in an existence defined by isolation. We understand that consciousness can be a curse. Lady Dimitrescu retained her cognition through the transformation, which is framed as a success in Miranda's research notes, a sign of her unusual compatibility with the Cadou. But that retained consciousness meant she had to experience the full horror of her existence with awareness. She couldn't escape into mindlessness. She couldn't forget what she'd been or what she'd become. She had to live every day knowing exactly what she was, what she did to survive, what she'd lost, and what she'd become. That awareness made her more sophisticated, more dangerous, more capable of elaborate psychological structures, but it also made her suffering more acute. Sometimes ignorance is mercy, and Lady Dimitrescu was denied that mercy completely. We understand that monsters in horror fiction work best when they're comprehensible without being excusable. Lady Dimitrescu became a cultural phenomenon not just because of her height or her design, though those certainly contributed, but because there's something recognizable in her psychology, the desperate need for approval from someone who doesn't care, the performance of identity to mask internal chaos, the construction of family to fill voids that can't otherwise be filled, the violence that emerges when carefully maintained structures collapse. These are human experiences, amplified and distorted through the lens of body horror and supernatural transformation, but recognizable at their core. And finally, we understand that horror is most effective when it operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, Lady Dimitrescu is a tall vampire lady in a castle, a visually striking antagonist with memorable design and imposing presence. Slightly deeper, she's a boss fight, a gameplay challenge that requires specific tactics to overcome. Deeper still, she's a representation of old world aristocracy clinging to relevance in a world that's moved past it, a commentary on class and power and the violence inherent in hierarchical systems. And at the deepest level, she's a psychological study in trauma, transformation, performance, and the desperate human need to maintain identity even when circumstances have rendered that identity impossible. All of these levels coexist, none negating the others. You can engage with Lady Dimitrescu at whatever depth you want. She works as a surface level antagonist, as a gameplay challenge, as a cultural meme, or as a complex psychological character. This layering is what makes her effective horror and effective character design. She rewards deeper examination without requiring it, offers complexity to those who look for it without punishing those who don't. What we've done tonight is excavate that deepest layer, pulling apart the psychological mechanisms to understand not just what Lady Dimitrescu does, but why she does it, what needs those actions fulfill, what fears they express, what traumas they reflect. And what we find when we excavate that deep is someone profoundly broken, desperately trying to maintain control over an existence that was never truly hers, performing identity with increasing desperation while the foundation crumbles beneath her, and finally collapsing when the last support structure falls away. She's a monster, yes, but she's a comprehensible monster, a monster whose monstrosity makes psychological sense when you understand the circumstances that created it, and that comprehensibility, that recognition of something almost human buried deep in the horror, is what elevates her from generic antagonist to genuinely compelling character study in survival horror.